"Happy anniversary," Daniel texted at 6:12 p.m., and exactly 9 minutes later, he walked into the restaurant with another woman on his arm while his wife was already seated 10 feet away watching him like she had never existed. Margaret Collins didn't move when she saw him. She didn't even blink right away, just sat there at the corner table near the window, her hands resting lightly on the white tablecloth, the faint glow of a candle reflecting in the polished silverware in front of her, and for a moment the entire room seemed to narrow into something quiet and precise, like the world had decided this was something she would survive only by staying perfectly still. The restaurant was one of those downtown places. People booked weeks in advance, dark wood, low lighting, the soft hum of jazz drifting through the speakers, couples leaning in close over wine glasses, waiters moving smoothly between tables carrying plates that smelled like butter and seared steak, and Margaret had arrived early 10 minutes before 7. Because that was the kind of person she had always been, careful, punctual, respectful of moments that were supposed to matter. 23 years of marriage deserved that much. She had chosen a navy dress, simple, nothing that tried too hard, a pair of low heels that wouldn't hurt if dinner ran long, and she had sat there reading the menu without really seeing it, replaying his message in her mind. Running late, happy anniversary. Noticing even then how the words felt added at the end like an afterthought. When the front door opened again, she didn't look up immediately, not until she heard his voice, that familiar low tone he used in public, controlled, almost charming. And when she finally lifted her eyes, she saw him clearly, Daniel Collins, her husband, standing near the host stand with his hand resting at the small of another woman's back, guiding her forward as if he had done it 100 times before. The woman was tall, blonde, composed in the way people are when they are comfortable being seen, wearing a cream-colored coat draped neatly over her shoulders, and she didn't hesitate when Daniel leaned slightly toward her. Didn't step back, didn't look uncertain, she simply smiled like she belonged there, like this evening had always been hers. Margaret watched as the host checked the reservation, nodded and reached for 2 menus, and that was when something inside her settled, not anger, not even disbelief, just a kind of clarity that moved in quietly and stayed. He hadn't made a mistake. He hadn't been caught off guard. This was planned, deliberate, placed exactly where it would be seen. She noticed small things then, the way Daniel didn't scan the room for her, didn't even pretend to look, the way his posture remained relaxed, confident, as if he had already decided how this would play out. And as the host led them further into the dining room, closer now, only a few tables away, Margaret could see the details she might have missed before. The familiarity in the way their arms brushed, the ease in their conversation, the absence of hesitation. This wasn't new. This wasn't accidental. She felt the cool stem of her water glass against her fingers and lifted it slightly, not to drink, just to steady her hand, and for a brief second she considered standing, walking over, saying his name, forcing him to look at her, forcing the moment into something loud and undeniable, but she didn't. She stayed exactly where she was, her back straight, her expression calm, her eyes following them as they reached a table set with the same white linen, the same candlelight, the same quiet promise of celebration. Daniel pulled out the chair for the woman, waited for her to sit, then took his own seat across from her, and when he finally turned his head just slightly, just enough to glance across the room, his eyes passed over Margaret without recognition, as if she were just another stranger having dinner on a Tuesday night. Margaret set her glass back down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table, and exhaled slowly through her nose, because in that moment she understood something simple and absolute. This was not the real humiliation yet. This was only the beginning, and Daniel Collins, sitting there under soft candlelight with a woman who was not his wife, had no idea who was already watching him, and more importantly, had no idea what she had already done before he even walked through that door. Margaret Collins kept her eyes on the table for a few seconds longer than necessary, not because she needed time to understand what she had just seen, but because she understood it too quickly, and that kind of clarity required control. She adjusted the position of her napkin, smoothing the edge against her lap, then reached for the menu again, lifting it just enough to create a natural barrier between herself and the rest of the room, and when she finally looked up, her gaze moved with quiet precision, not searching, not panicked, just observing. Daniel and the woman were already settled into their seats, a small pool of candlelight resting between them, and a waiter had approached their table with the same polite tone Margaret had heard minutes earlier, offering water, reciting specials, treating them like any other couple celebrating something worth remembering. Margaret noticed how easily Daniel spoke, how his posture remained relaxed, one arm resting along the back of his chair, the other gesturing lightly as he talked, and the woman Sophie, though Margaret did not know her name yet, leaned forward slightly, attentive, comfortable, as if she had been sitting across from him like this for a long time. There was no hesitation between them, no awkwardness, only familiarity, and that was what confirmed everything. Margaret lowered her menu and reached for her water, taking a small sip, the coolness grounding, steady, and then she did something simple, something that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying attention. She turned her chair just a few degrees, aligning her body so that she had a clearer view of their table without appearing to watch them directly. She did not need to hear every word, she only needed to see enough. A few minutes passed, the rhythm of the restaurant continuing around her, glasses clinking, soft laughter drifting between tables, the low hum of conversation filling the space, and then she saw it, Daniel reaching across the table, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but in a small practiced gesture. His fingers brushing against the woman's hand, lingering just a second longer than necessary, and the woman did not pull away. She smiled instead, a quiet, knowing smile that belonged to someone who had already stepped into a role that was not hers. Margaret set her glass down carefully, her expression unchanged, her breathing even, and in that moment, the humiliation settled into something sharper, not overwhelming, not chaotic but defined. This was not an accident, not a lapse in judgment. This was a decision made in advance, a scene arranged with intention. She watched as the waiter returned with a bottle of wine, Daniel nodding approvingly as it was poured. And then almost casually, Daniel glanced around the room again, not searching for her, not worried but assessing, as if confirming something, as if making sure everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Margaret noticed that too, and that was when the second layer revealed itself. This dinner was not just about bringing another woman into a place that was supposed to belong to his marriage, it was about control, about positioning, about sending a message that had not yet been spoken out loud. She leaned back slightly in her chair, allowing herself a broader view of the room, and that was when she saw the host speaking quietly to a manager near the entrance, both of them glancing briefly toward Daniel's table before returning to their conversation, subtle, but deliberate. Margaret's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion but in recognition. Arrangements had been made. She reached into her purse then, her movements calm, unhurried, and pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up softly in her hand. She did not open any messages, did not scroll, she simply checked the time, then locked the screen again and placed it back inside, because timing mattered, and she had already set things in motion long before Daniel had walked through that door. She folded her hands together on the table, her fingers resting lightly against each other, and allowed herself one more look toward him, not with anger, not with sadness, but with a quiet understanding that had already moved past both. Daniel laughed at something the woman said, a short, easy laugh, and for a brief moment, he looked exactly like the man he had always been in public, confident, assured, certain of his place in the world, and Margaret recognized that version of him, because she had helped build it, piece by piece, year after year. But what he did not recognize, what he had never fully understood, was the person sitting 10 feet away from him in that same room. The person who had watched him carefully for months, who had noticed the changes, the patterns, the quiet shifts in behavior that did not happen by accident. Margaret Collins did not react, she did not interrupt, she did not announce her presence because she did not need to. Whatever Daniel believed this night was going to be, whatever role he thought she would play in it, he had already made his first mistake, and he did not know it yet. Margaret Collins remained seated exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if nothing in the room required her attention, but her awareness had sharpened, narrowing in on details that most people would never notice, and that was when the evening began to shift from something personal into something structured. She watched as a second waiter approached Daniel's table, not the one who had taken their order, but someone else, slightly older, more composed, the kind of staff member who handled specific guests. And there was a brief exchange, quiet, almost invisible, but deliberate, a nod, a glance toward the entrance, then back to Daniel, and Margaret understood immediately that this dinner extended beyond two people sharing a table. She reached for the bread plate in front of her, breaking off a small piece without eating it, just holding it lightly between her fingers as she continued to observe. Because the pattern was becoming clearer now. Daniel was not improvising, he was following a plan, and the woman across from him, Sophie, was part of it, not just emotionally but functionally. Margaret noticed how Sophie's posture shifted when the waiter returned, how she straightened slightly, her shoulders aligning, her attention sharpening in a way that suggested anticipation, not surprise, and that was when Margaret's gaze moved again, this time toward the entrance of the restaurant. The doors opened and a couple stepped inside, well-dressed, mid-50s, the man adjusting his jacket as he scanned the room, the woman resting her hand lightly on his arm, and within seconds, the host approached them with a level of attentiveness that signaled familiarity, not just customers but expected arrivals. Margaret did not look back at Daniel immediately, she did not need to because she already knew what she would see. The timing was too precise, the arrangement too clean. When she finally shifted her eyes again, Daniel had already noticed them. His body turning slightly in his chair, his expression changing just enough to signal recognition, and then something else, something almost satisfied. He leaned toward Sophie, said something brief, and she nodded, her smile adjusting into something more polished, more intentional. Margaret set the piece of bread back onto the plate without taking a bite and folded her hands together again. Her movement steady, controlled, because now the structure was fully visible. This was not just about humiliation, it was about audience. Daniel stood up as the couple approached his table, greeting the man first with a firm handshake, then offering a polite nod to the woman, and Sophie followed his lead, rising smoothly, her expression composed as introductions were made. Margaret could not hear the words, but she did not need to, the body language was enough, the positioning, the slight shift in Daniel's stance, the way he angled himself just enough to present Sophie not as someone secondary, but as someone relevant, someone who belonged in that moment. Margaret's eyes moved briefly across the room, noticing how a few nearby tables had gone slightly quieter, how attention, subtle but real, had begun to gather around that interaction. And that was when she understood the final layer. Daniel had not only chosen this place and this night, he had chosen witnesses. She reached for her water again, taking another small sip, her gaze steady, and allowed herself one slow breath, because everything she needed to confirm had already revealed itself. The late nights, the sudden financial adjustments, the quiet conversations that ended when she entered the room, the documents she had reviewed weeks earlier. All of it aligned now into something clean and undeniable. Daniel was not just stepping out of his marriage, he was repositioning himself publicly, reshaping perception, building a version of reality that excluded her before she had the chance to respond. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her shoulders relaxed, her expression unchanged, because she had anticipated this move long before tonight, and she had prepared for it in ways Daniel had not considered. Across the room he laughed again, this time louder, more confident as the conversation at his table continued, the couple now seated, the dynamic expanding, the performance unfolding exactly as he intended. But Margaret Collins did not interrupt, she did not stand, she did not call his name because she understood something he did not. Control was not about reacting first, it was about choosing the moment. And Daniel had just spent the last 20 minutes building a stage he believed belonged to him, without realizing who had already arranged. What would happen next? Margaret Collins remained still as the conversation at Daniel's table expanded, her gaze steady but indirect, watching the rhythm rather than the details, because by now the details were no longer necessary. The structure had already revealed itself, and what mattered was how it would unfold next. The couple who had joined them settled comfortably into their seats, their posture relaxed, their expressions open, and within seconds, the tone of the table shifted from private to performative. Voices slightly louder, gestures more deliberate, the kind of subtle change that happens when people know they are being observed, even if they pretend they are not. Margaret noticed how Daniel adjusted his position again, leaning back just enough to appear at ease, but forward enough to remain engaged, controlling the center of the conversation, and Sophie mirrored him carefully, her timing precise, her smiles measured, as if she understood exactly what role she was meant to play in that moment. Margaret reached for her fork and aligned it parallel to the knife beside it. A small, quiet action but deliberate, something to anchor her hands as her mind moved ahead of the scene in front of her. She glanced briefly toward the bar, where a man in a dark suit stood reviewing something on his tablet, not drinking, not socializing, just present, and for a fraction of a second their eyes met, and he gave the slightest nod before returning to his screen. Margaret did not react, but she registered it, filed it away, because nothing about this evening had been left to chance. Across the room, a waiter approached Daniel's table again, this time carrying a leather folder, placing it gently beside Daniel's hand, not opening it, not announcing anything, just setting it there as if it belonged, and Margaret felt the shift immediately. The bill had arrived far too early for a table that had just begun their main course, and Daniel noticed it too, his expression flickering for the briefest moment before settling back into control. He said something to the waiter, low, controlled, but the waiter only nodded once and stepped back, leaving the folder exactly where it was. Sophie glanced at it, then at Daniel, her smile tightening just slightly, the first sign of uncertainty breaking through her composed exterior. Margaret lowered her gaze to her own table, letting a few seconds pass, then reached for her water again, her movements unhurried because timing mattered more than action, and she had already chosen hers. She could feel the subtle change in the room now, not obvious, not dramatic, but present, like a current moving just beneath the surface, as if something unseen had shifted the balance without announcing it. Daniel picked up the folder, opened it halfway, and Margaret watched from the corner of her vision as his posture adjusted again. Not dramatically, just enough to signal that something inside that folder did not match his expectations. He closed it quickly, said something to Sophie and the couple across from him, something that sounded light, dismissive, but the timing was wrong, the rhythm slightly off, and Margaret knew that he had just encountered the first piece of information he had not planned for. She rested her hands lightly on the edge of the table, her fingers relaxed, her shoulders still, because this was the moment where most people would react, would move, would interrupt, but she did not. She let it build. The waiter returned, this time accompanied by the manager, the same one who had been near the entrance earlier, and their presence at Daniel's table was polite but firm, the kind of attention reserved for something that required clarification. Margaret could not hear the words, but she did not need to. She could see the way Daniel's expression tightened, the way Sophie's posture stiffened, the way the couple exchanged a brief glance that carried more meaning than conversation. Margaret Collins remained exactly where she was, her presence quiet, her control absolute, because Daniel believed he had created this moment, believed he was guiding the narrative, but what he was holding in his hands was not just a bill. It was the beginning of something he had not prepared for, and he still did not understand why. Daniel Collins did not look up immediately after the manager arrived, and that was the first real sign that something had shifted beyond his control. Instead, he kept his eyes on the folder for a second longer than necessary, as if reading it again might change what was written there, then closed it carefully and placed it flat on the table, aligning it with the edge of his plate in a gesture that appeared calm but carried a trace of calculation. The manager spoke quietly, his tone professional, measured, but firm enough to indicate that this was not a routine interruption, and Daniel responded in the same low voice, controlled, almost dismissive, the way he handled situations he believed he could resolve with a few words and the right posture. Sophie remained still beside him, her earlier confidence now slightly restrained, her hands folded together, her gaze moving between Daniel and the manager with a subtle tension that had not been there before. Across from them, the couple who had joined shifted in their seats, not dramatically, but enough to create distance, their attention no longer fully engaged in conversation, but redirected toward the exchange unfolding in front of them. Margaret Collins watched all of this without turning her head, her awareness moving through the room like a quiet current, picking up the changes in tone, the pauses, the small fractures in the rhythm Daniel had tried to establish. She reached for her napkin and adjusted it. Again, not because it needed adjusting, but because it gave her hands something to do while she waited. Time was important now, not in minutes but in moments, in the sequence of reactions that would follow. The manager gestured lightly toward the folder, then toward the entrance, and Daniel's expression shifted again, just slightly, the kind of shift that would go unnoticed by anyone who did not know him well, but Margaret knew him well enough to see it immediately. It was not confusion, not yet, but it was no longer certainty. Daniel said something, a short sentence, controlled, likely a question, and the manager responded with a single nod before stepping back half a step, not leaving but allowing space, as if the next move belonged to Daniel. Sophie leaned closer then, her voice low, her expression composed but no longer effortless, and Margaret could see the question in her posture, the subtle tightening of her shoulders, the way her smile did not fully return. Daniel picked up the folder again, this time opening it more deliberately, scanning the contents with greater focus, and Margaret noticed how his fingers paused against the paper, how his thumb pressed slightly harder along the edge, a small sign of tension breaking through his otherwise controlled exterior. The couple across from him exchanged another glance, brief but meaningful, and the woman reached for her glass, taking a slow sip as if giving herself a reason not to speak. The room itself had not changed, the music continued, the conversations around them flowed as before, But within that small space at Daniel's table, something had begun to unravel quietly without announcement. Margaret rested her hands on the table again, her fingers still, her posture unchanged, because she had already anticipated this moment, the exact point where Daniel's plan would meet something he had not accounted for. She glanced briefly toward the entrance once more, where the host stood now with a composed expression, watching discreetly, and then her eyes moved back to Daniel, not directly, but enough to register the change that was becoming more visible. He leaned back slightly in his chair, a gesture that might have been interpreted as casual, but Margaret recognized it for what it was, a recalibration, an attempt to regain control of a situation that was no longer entirely his. Sophie's hand moved toward her glass, but she did not drink, her fingers resting against it as if unsure whether to continue the performance or step back from it. Margaret allowed herself one slow breath, steady and quiet, because everything was aligning exactly as it should. Daniel had created the setting, chosen the timing, assembled the audience, but he had overlooked one detail, the only detail that mattered, and now, sitting there with the folder in his hands and the manager waiting patiently beside him, he was beginning to understand that this evening was not unfolding the way he had intended, and he still did not know why. Daniel Collins sat very still for a moment after closing the folder the second time, and that stillness was different from before, not controlled, not intentional but forced, like his body had paused while his mind tried to catch up. He lifted his eyes toward the manager again, this time holding the look a fraction longer, and spoke in a tone that carried more weight than before, quieter, sharper, the kind of voice he used when he expected immediate correction. But the manager did not correct anything, he simply repeated something, just a few words, and gave a small, confirming nod that did not leave room for interpretation. Sophie shifted in her seat beside him, her posture no longer perfectly aligned, her shoulders slightly drawn in, her gaze moving between Daniel and the folder with growing uncertainty, and across the table, the couple who had joined them had stopped pretending to be part of the conversation entirely, their attention now fully focused on what was unfolding, their expressions polite but no longer relaxed. Margaret Collins did not move, but she felt the exact moment the balance tipped, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. She reached for her water again, lifting the glass halfway before setting it back down without drinking, because she did not need anything to steady herself anymore, she was already steady. Daniel opened the folder again, slower this time, reading more carefully, his eyes moving line by line, and Margaret could almost see the sequence in his mind, the expectation, the assumption, and then the disruption, the detail that did not belong, the one thing he had not accounted for. His jaw tightened slightly, just enough to break the illusion of ease, and he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, bringing himself closer to the paper as if proximity would change the outcome. Sophie leaned in as well, her voice low, asking something, and Daniel answered without looking at her, his tone controlled but clipped, the kind of answer that closed a conversation rather than invited one. The manager remained beside them, patient, composed, not intrusive but not leaving either, his presence a quiet confirmation that whatever was written in that folder required acknowledgement, not discussion. Margaret's gaze shifted briefly toward the man at the bar again, the one with the tablet, and he was no longer looking down. He was watching now, discreetly but directly, and when their eyes met again there was no nod this time, just recognition, as if a step had been completed and the next one was already in motion. Daniel closed the folder once more, this time with less care, and placed it back on the table, but not aligned anymore, slightly off-center, a small detail that Margaret noticed immediately, because Daniel always aligned things, always kept edges straight, always maintained order, and now that order had slipped. He said something to the manager again, a longer sentence this time, his tone firmer, almost irritated beneath the surface, and the manager listened, then responded with the same calm tone, the same measured delivery, and Margaret knew exactly what that meant. There would be no adjustment, no correction, no reversal. Sophie sat back slightly, her hands no longer folded but resting apart, one near her glass, the other on the table, her fingers tapping once, then stopping, as if she had caught herself, and the couple across from them exchanged another glance, this one longer, heavier, the kind of look people share when they realize they have stepped into something they did not fully understand. Margaret allowed herself one slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling just slightly, because everything had now reached the point she had been waiting for, the moment where Daniel could no longer pretend the evening was his to control. He leaned back in his chair again, but this time the movement lacked the earlier confidence, it was slower, more deliberate, as if he were recalibrating not just the situation, but his position within it. He looked around the room then briefly, not searching for her, not yet, but searching for something else, something that would explain what was happening, something that would restore the logic he believed he had established. Margaret Collins remained exactly where she was, her presence quiet, her expression unchanged, because she knew something Daniel did not, something he was only beginning to realize as he sat there with the folder in front of him and the manager still waiting patiently at his side. This was not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, not a simple correction. This was intentional, precise, and already completed before he had even taken his seat. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Collins was no longer the one directing what came next. Daniel Collins finally looked up from the table, not toward the manager this time, not toward Sophie or the couple sitting across from him, but outward, scanning the room with a subtle shift in his eyes that suggested he was no longer searching for answers inside the folder, but outside of it, and that was when the uncertainty became visible in a way it had not been before. It was not panic, not even close, but it was no longer control. Margaret Collins noticed it immediately, the slight delay in his movements, the way his gaze paused just a fraction longer on certain points in the room, as if he were trying to locate something that would make the situation make sense again. She did not move, she did not react, but she understood exactly what he was doing. He was looking for context, for a missing piece, for someone else responsible. Sophie followed his gaze briefly, then leaned in toward him again, her voice lower now, more cautious, asking something that required reassurance, and Daniel answered. But this time his tone lacked the earlier certainty. It was still controlled, still measured, but there was a layer beneath it now, something tighter, something less stable. The manager remained where he was, hands loosely folded, posture unchanged, waiting without pressure, and that waiting itself carried weight, because it made clear that the situation was not negotiable, only confirmable. The couple across from them had shifted further back in their chairs, creating a subtle distance that did not need to be acknowledged out loud, their involvement reduced to observation, their earlier interest replaced with something quieter, more cautious. Margaret reached for her glass again, lifting it slowly, taking a small sip this time, the cool water, steadying not her emotions but the pacing of the moment, because she knew that timing was everything now, and she had no intention of rushing what Daniel had already begun to unravel on his own. He picked up the folder again, almost reflexively, as if confirming the contents once more might produce a different outcome, but his fingers moved more quickly this time, less careful, flipping the page slightly before stopping, his eyes scanning, then narrowing just enough to signal recognition of something specific. Margaret watched that shift carefully because that was the point where understanding began, not complete, not fully formed, but present. Daniel's posture changed again, his shoulders drawing back, his chin lifting slightly, as if he were attempting to restore the version of himself that had entered the restaurant earlier that evening. But the timing was wrong, the adjustment came too late, after the structure had already shifted. Sophie noticed it too, the way his body language no longer matched the situation, and her expression followed, her earlier composure giving way to a more guarded stillness, her hands now resting flat on the table, no longer part of the performance but part of the pause. Margaret let a few more seconds pass, watching the sequence unfold exactly as she had anticipated, because Daniel had reached the edge of realization, and what came next would not come from her, it would come from him. He looked at the manager again, this time holding the gaze longer, asking something that was not just procedural but personal, and the manager responded with the same calm tone, the same measured delivery, but with one small addition, a brief gesture toward the entrance, subtle, almost polite but intentional. Daniel followed that gesture, turning his head slightly, his eyes moving toward the front of the restaurant, and for the first time since he had walked in, his focus shifted away from the table entirely. Margaret saw it happen the exact moment his attention redirected, and she knew that this was the point he had not planned for, the moment where the evening would begin to move beyond his control in a way he could no longer contain. She remained seated, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, because she had already chosen her role in this, and it did not require interruption, it did not require confrontation, it only required presence. Daniel Collins believed he had orchestrated the night, believed he had arranged every detail. But as his gaze fixed toward the entrance and the manager stepped slightly aside, making space for what was about to happen next, he was finally beginning to understand that he was no longer the one deciding how the evening would unfold, and he still did not know who was. Daniel Collins followed the manager's subtle gesture toward the entrance, and for a moment, everything at his table paused without anyone acknowledging it, as if the air itself had shifted direction. The restaurant doors opened again, not dramatically, not with noise or urgency, but with quiet precision, and a man stepped inside, dressed simply but with the kind of understated confidence that did not need attention to be noticed. His posture straight, his pace unhurried, his eyes scanning the room once before settling on a single point. Margaret Collins did not turn immediately. She did not need to, because she already knew exactly who had arrived and exactly when. She let 3 seconds pass, then 4, allowing the moment to form fully before she shifted her gaze toward the entrance, her expression unchanged, her breathing even, as if this were just another detail in a sequence she had already memorized. Daniel remained still, his eyes fixed in that direction now, his earlier composure thinning into something quieter, more uncertain, as he tried to place the connection, to understand why the manager had directed his attention there. In the first place, Sophie followed his gaze again, her posture tightening slightly, her fingers now resting flat against the table without movement, her earlier ease gone, replaced by a careful stillness that mirrored the shift in Daniel without matching his control. The couple across from them turned as well, slower, more cautiously, their curiosity now open, no longer disguised as casual interest, because something about the man entering the restaurant carried weight. Not obvious, not announced, but present in the way the host stepped forward immediately, in the way the staff adjusted their posture just slightly, in the way the room acknowledged him without interrupting itself. Margaret watched all of this without reacting, because she had already accounted for every step, every movement, every second that would bring the evening to this point. The man exchanged a brief word with the host, then began walking further inside, not toward Daniel, not yet, but along a path that would inevitably pass through his line of sight, and Daniel's attention followed him unconsciously, his focus narrowing, his mind searching for recognition, for context, for something that would explain why this moment felt connected to everything else that had begun to unravel. Margaret reached for her napkin again, folding it once, then placing it back down with deliberate care, her hands steady, her movements small, controlled, because she understood something Daniel was only beginning to sense. This was no longer about the dinner or the woman beside him or even the audience he had gathered. This was about positioning, about information, about decisions that had been made before he arrived. The man continued walking, his pace unchanged until he reached the bar, where he paused briefly, speaking quietly to the man with the tablet, and the two exchanged a short, efficient interaction that ended with a nod, not casual, not friendly, but confirming. Daniel saw that too, and Margaret could almost trace the exact moment his mind began connecting pieces that had not previously aligned, the folder, the manager, the timing, the presence of someone he did not expect. Sophie leaned closer to him again, her voice low, asking something more directly now, and Daniel responded, but this time he did not look at her while he spoke, his eyes still fixed toward the bar, his attention divided, his control no longer complete. The couple across from them had stopped pretending entirely. Their bodies angled slightly away from the table now, their focus outward, their involvement reduced to silent observation of something they did not understand but could no longer ignore. Margaret allowed another breath to pass, slow and even, because everything was moving exactly as it should, the sequence unfolding without interruption, without deviation, and that was the point. She did not need to act, did not need to speak, did not need to reveal anything prematurely, because the structure itself was doing the work. The man at the bar finished his brief exchange, then turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room once more, and this time it did not pass over Daniel, it stopped. Daniel felt it immediately, the directness of it, the weight of being seen in a way that was no longer passive, and he straightened slightly in his chair, instinctively, as if preparing for something he could not yet define. Margaret watched that moment carefully. The exact second Daniel shifted from observer to participant, and she knew that this was where everything would change. The man began walking again, this time with purpose, his direction clear, his focus steady, and as he moved closer, the distance between him and Daniel's table closing with each step, the tension in that small space grew without a single word being spoken. Margaret Collins remained exactly where she was, her presence quiet, her control absolute, because Daniel Collins had spent the entire evening believing he was leading the narrative, but as the man approached and the manager stepped aside completely, clearing the space without announcement, the reality became impossible to ignore. This night had never belonged to him. and he was only now beginning to understand that the person who had arranged everything had been sitting 10 feet away the entire time. The man stopped at the edge of Daniel Collins's table without announcing himself, and for a moment no one spoke, not because they were unsure what to say, but because the silence itself had already said enough. Daniel looked up at him fully now, his posture straightening instinctively, his expression shifting into something more formal, more guarded, as if he had stepped into a meeting he did not schedule but could not avoid. And the man returned the look with calm precision, not hostile, not warm, simply certain. He nodded once, a small, controlled gesture, then spoke in a tone that carried just enough weight to settle the table without raising it, addressing Daniel by name, confirming identity, confirming presence, and Daniel responded automatically, his voice steady, but Margaret Collins could hear the difference even from across the room, the slight tightening beneath the control, the subtle adjustment in pacing, the way each word was placed more carefully than before. Sophie remained silent beside him, her posture now completely still, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by a quiet alertness that suggested she understood she was no longer part of the center of this interaction. The couple across from them leaned back further, creating space not just physically, but socially, removing themselves from the exchange without leaving the table, their role reduced to witnesses. The man continued speaking briefly, efficiently, referencing the folder without touching it, referencing the arrangement without explaining it. And as he spoke, Daniel's expression changed again, not dramatically but undeniably, the lines around his mouth tightening, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in anger but in recognition. Margaret watched that moment carefully because that was where the understanding landed, not fully, not completely, but enough. Daniel asked a question then, short, direct, and the man answered with the same calm tone, the same measured clarity, leaving no room for interpretation. And when he finished, he did not wait for approval, he simply inclined his head once more and stepped back, not leaving the area but no longer engaging, his role complete. Daniel remained seated, his hand resting near the folder but not touching it, his gaze fixed on a point slightly beyond the table, as if recalculating something that had already been decided without him. Sophie turned toward him, her voice low, asking something again, but this time he did not answer immediately. And when he did, it was brief, controlled, but lacking the earlier assurance, the rhythm broken in a way that could not be repaired in the moment. The couple across from them exchanged one last glance, then the woman reached for her glass again, taking a slow sip, as if marking the end of their involvement in whatever had just occurred. Margaret Collins let a few seconds pass, then finally moved. She reached for her purse, opened it, and placed a small card on the table beside her plate. Not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. Then she stood, smoothing her dress lightly, her posture composed, her expression calm. She did not look toward Daniel immediately, she did not need to, because she knew he would feel it, the shift, the presence, the moment when she chose to enter the space he believed he controlled. And he did, his head turning almost instinctively, his eyes finding her across the distance, and for the first time that evening recognition was immediate, complete, unavoidable. Margaret met his gaze without emotion, without accusation, without explanation, and held it for exactly 1 second before looking away, not dismissive, not dramatic, just final. She stepped away from her table, her heels soft against the floor, moving toward the exit at an even pace, passing within a few feet of his table without stopping, without slowing, without acknowledging anyone else seated there. The manager moved slightly to the side to clear her path, his posture respectful, his attention quiet, and as Margaret reached the front of the restaurant, the host opened the door for her without being asked, the cool night air meeting her as she stepped outside. Behind her, the room continued, the music, the conversations, the soft clink of glasses, but at Daniel's table, nothing had returned to normal. He looked down at the folder once more, then back toward the entrance where she had just disappeared, and for the first time that night, the realization settled fully, not as confusion, not as irritation, but as clarity. This had never been his stage, never his narrative, never his moment of control. Margaret Collins had paid for everything long before he arrived, and what he thought was a performance had been something else entirely, something precise, something quiet, something he had not understood until it was already finished, and by the time he did, there was nothing left for him to change.